And so the torch reached Britain. Into the Wembley Stadium came the herald of health and peace. In Britain, in spite of conflicting beliefs, there was peace. Here, at least, was a proper setting for the 14th Olympiad of this restless modern era. The long journey from Olympus was over. From the torch, the flame flared up. In Berlin, the Olympic Stadium stood silent and deserted. Berlin, shattered, crushed, stricken. Berlin, where 4 flags dominate a divided city. Here, a defeated people depended on their conquerors for the wherewithal to live. Here was life reduced to its essentials. Here, the hungry and cold bartered their few possessions for necessities, for food, clothing, and warmth. Berlin, embedded deep in Soviet-occupied territory. Supplies for the western sectors had to cross this Soviet zone. By road, rail, and water came the precious food, yet barely enough for meager rations. The black market had reached colossal proportions. Money changed hands and began to lose its value. Civilian and military police made periodic raids, but only a few were ever caught. The situation called for drastic action. The Western powers announced the withdrawal of all currency in their sectors. Bewildered Berliners suffered yet another disruption in their lives. Into the pulping machine went the old Reich marks. New currency was printed and issued. A currency which the Russians refused to recognize. But in the Western sectors, the measure was successful. Goods diverted from the black market came back into the shops. But Russian reaction was immediate. All transport to Berlin was stopped. On the platforms and in the sidings, the goods piled up, goods vital to the waiting Berliners. And then, once again, anxious Germans heard the drone of Allied planes. But this time, they brought not death, but life itself. Day after day, over the Russian barriers, transport planes shuttled to and from Berlin. And the cargo they carried was food. For the moment, at least, Berlin was being fed. At The Hague, the Council of the Western Alliance met to discuss the Berlin situation. The representatives agreed on firm resistance to Russian pressure. In Britain, Mr. Churchill said,
"Last month, on May the 4th, our Foreign Secretary, Mr. Bevin, said in Parliament, 'We are in Berlin as of right. It is our intention to stay there.' The only hope of peace is to be strong, to act with other great freedom-loving nations, and to make it plain to the aggressor, while time remains, that we shall rally the free men of the world and defend ourselves and our cause by every means should the aggressor strike a felon blow.
Meanwhile, in Berlin, the blockade continued. Meanwhile, too, the airlift had grown. Berlin's airports had become the provisioning centers for 2.5 million Germans. The greatest airborne loads since the Burma campaign were being lifted over the Soviet zone. 350 flights a day, 2,000 tons of food, raw materials, and coal. Regardless of cost, Berlin was being fueled, her population fed. But for how long? In the city, the military governors of the occupying powers strove to reach agreement. The tension grew. Sector boundaries were strengthened, emphasized. The line that divided east from west was made clear for all to see. The political tension between the occupying powers was reflected in the civil population. Communists marched through the streets. Demonstrations, strikes, and violence were the order of the day. Near the Reichstag, huge crowds assembled to hear the leader of the Social Democrats, Ernst Neuman, indict the Russians. Scaling the Brandenburg Tor, German youths started to tear down the Russian flag. Soviet troops opened fire. The conflict between East and West was focused on Berlin. The peoples of the world stood by, hoping for agreement and peace.